Alireza Jafarzadeh is the deputy director in the U.S. Office of the National Council of the Resistance of Iran. And you yourself have been a victim in the past of an Iranian regime plot to kidnap and kill you. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. Back in
Okay.
2018,
Okay.
two Iranian regime agents were arrested for that purpose.
So I just wanted to get that clear and get that out there quickly. Um, Today, there's a Washington Post article that indicates that Western governments are really concerned about this. Again, your case was back in 2018, and this 2022 is 4 years later. So tell us briefly what took place in your case.
Well, in my case, it was 2 years ago in August of 2018, actually 4 years ago, that the FBI arrested two agents of the Iranian regime, one that had come directly from Iran and the other one that was already stationed here. And the focus was that these two agents were spying on our activities here in Washington or wherever we were going, whether we were in Los Angeles or in New York and other places, taking pictures, getting close to us and identifying, trying to figure out a pattern of activities. And before they were able to carry out what the Justice Department said was the capture and kill operation, they were arrested, and eventually they confessed that they were working on behalf of the Ministry of Intelligence in Tehran, and they were convicted by the court and sentenced to several years in prison.
Why were they after you, Alireza?
Well, I think, this regime is built on repression inside Iran and terrorism outside of Iran. And their main target are actually those who are standing up to the Iranian regime. And of course, our movement, and it's not just about me, it's about the whole movement, has been the main force for change in Iran for, almost from day one after the Ayatollahs came to power. So they constantly want to eliminate any voice of dissent, especially those who are in the forefront of the fighting of the Iran regime. It's this movement that has been very, very effective in exposing the whole terror network of the Iran regime. This is the movement that exposed all the major nuclear sites of Iran, that triggered the inspections of Iranian nuclear sites by the UN nuclear watchdog known as the IAEA. As a result of that, a whole host of UN Security Council resolutions came about and put pressure on the Iranian regime. It's this movement which is the engine for change inside Iran. Their members and supporters, their activists, their network inside Iran has been involved in instigating, demonstrations and protest acts. And now, in the midst of the Iran Revolution, today is day 76. They are really in the forefront of it as engine for change. So the Ayatollahs want to destroy the movement in any way they can. Inside Iran, they had a massacre of 1988. As many as 30,000 political prisoners were massacred in a matter of few months. In that summer, 90% of them belonged to this movement. And then, so that's, that explains why the regime wants to carry out terror operations outside of the country, because they feel this movement is effective inside Iran. It's also effective outside of Iran. They want to silence the voices who are exposing the regime, who are speaking on behalf of the people of Iran, who are informing members of Congress, the media, and the public opinion. That's really the whole purpose of all of those terrorist activities that they have plotted before and they're plotting today.
How did the U.S. authorities approach you when they told you about this?
Actually, I read it in the newspaper. I saw a report about the arrest of two agents. I just got interested and wanted to see, what was the story. And once I read the story, I saw that there was an affidavit filed by the Justice Department. I picked it up and I read the affidavit, that I saw all the details there.
So wait a minute.
So
This was all taking place, these arrests and everything, without your knowledge?
yes, yes, I wasn't aware of it, and of course, I'm sure, obviously, the authorities were watching the whole situation. They anticipated that clearly that we would be
So
a prime target.
what is your status here in the U.S.? Are you a U.S. citizen?
Yes, I've lived here for almost 45 years,
That's
and
that's that's
yes.
what I thought. So why didn't they tell you what was going on?
Well, I don't know how what's the modus operandi when it comes to the Justice Department and the FBI. Once they round up people and contain the threat, or they just want to, I don't know what the pattern is, but for whatever reason they chose to basically deal with the perpetrators, and maybe at the time they thought that they arrested all the people who were key players in this case.
Hmm. Speaking about more broadly, this propensity to do this kind of thing, there was a situation several years ago down in Georgetown in Washington where there's a very popular restaurant there. And there was an attempt by the Iranian government to hire someone. And I think this guy was a used car salesman or something like that down in Texas, to blow
Yes.
up this very popular restaurant while the Saudi ambassador was in there, or someone else. But that's as a place that I actually go to myself. I found that very alarming, that this could have taken place had this individual gone through with it. But also of note too was the fact that they hired a used car salesman to do this kind of thing. And this appears to be a part of their pattern. Why do they do that?
Well, the Iranian regime, because the terrorism is a very, very central pillar of their existence. It's a key element of their foreign policy. It's based on terrorism. All of the main task of the regime's embassies is not to resolve the consular issues, rather to act as hub for terrorism. A couple of years ago, we put out a book called "The Emissaries of Terror." And it shows, gets into the details of the terror operations by the Ministry of Intelligence and also the Quds Force of the Revolutionary Guards. But it shows the role of the embassies, how they are acting as facilitators and providing intelligence and know-how. The diplomatic pouches is in the service, providing the diplomatic cover to hide things for them. And then once their terrorists are arrested, they get involved in getting them released. And so after several years, the intelligence agencies around the world have realized, the way the regime operates, how they use, which elements they use, which tactics they use. Remember, in the 80s and 90s, you had the hostage taking in Lebanon, that the regime used Hezbollah in taking Western nationals, including American citizens and journalists, taking them hostage, and then getting involved in getting them released, and then getting ransom for it, getting rewards for it. But after a while, they realized this may not exactly work, and they need like parallel tactics. So they started resorting to hiring foreign nationals who are not like the usual suspects. In this case, you mentioned that they wanted to target the Saudi ambassador in Washington. They had hired this used car salesperson in Texas for him to hire drug dealers from Mexico. This is something that is not their norm, but they use that. They use any tactic that could produce results for them, and that's why if you are focusing on one element or one area, you may find there is another place that you need to look at. And that's for that reason, I think if anyone wants to counter the Iran regime's terrorism, they need to look at the whole thing as a full package, that you need to make the regime pay the price. It doesn't matter what tactic they're using, which area they're operating outside of the country. The regime has to pay the price for every terror plot, successful or unsuccessful. And to the contrary, look at the whole situation. Tehran has been rewarded for those terrorism, and they're willing to, exchange, hostages and paying money to get them, released. You remember the Iran-Contra affairs back in the 80s, that, the cake and the colt and the Bible, with some 2,000 TOW missiles that was sent to Iran and a plane load of weapons by senior American officials, trying to convince the Iranian regime that, okay, this is what we're going to give you. You give us our hostages back. If that mentality overlooks the policy of the United States or European nations, that's like ensuring that this terrorism continues. And I think that's the biggest problem. And when it comes to the Western nations in dealing with the regime, their policies is not built around ending terrorism. They're just trying to resolve the issue piece by piece, and they're actually expanding it.
Okay. Alireza Jafarzadeh, Deputy Director of the U.S. Office, which is here in Washington, of the National Council of the Resistance of Iran. Thank you, as always, and thank you for this specific information today.
Thanks a lot. Always a good pleasure, JJ.
Shawn Turner, former Director of Communications for the Director of National Intelligence, Jim Clapper. Thank you for being with us.
Thanks for having me, JJ.
We've been wrestling in this country with what happened on January 6th for a while, and we're starting now to see some fairly high-profile people that were involved. We're starting to see their trials come to an end, and one of the most significant trials was this week Stewart Rhodes, who was or is, I don't know what his status is, the head of the Oath Keepers group, convicted of seditious activities. And I'm wondering how you think that sits with the scope of everything that took place that day and the other folks that are out there waiting for their turn in court, or at least those people that may end up in court.
Yeah. JJ, I think that in order to really understand the significance of this conviction, we have to take a step back and look at the broader picture with regard to accountability for January 6th. We are almost 2 years since the attack on the Capitol. And when we look at the number of people who have been charged, we're looking at just under 1,000 people who have been federally charged with crimes related to January 6th. And a little under half of those people have pleaded guilty. When we think about the sort of span or scope of accountability, we have everything from people being found not guilty and acquitted to people serving some jail time or being sentenced to some jail time. But none of the charges against any of those people are as serious as the charge of seditious conspiracy. And so when we think about the people out there who are watching the accountability aspect of this, I think that up until this conviction, we certainly had people who may have thought to themselves, look, a little bit of prison time, maybe a smack on the hand, being charged with a misdemeanor is something that they might be willing to risk in order to engage in this type of behavior again. But I think that with these convictions, the Justice Department, the United States government has sent a very clear message that there will be high-level accountability for an attack on our government and for any attempt to disrupt the lawful transition of power. So I think that this sends the right message. I think that it will have a chilling effect on those who might be thinking that this may have been the beginning of something. Look, this sentence comes with a sentence of up to 20 years, and that's something that I think they're going to take very serious.
Well, Shawn, the question I want to ask now, based on what you just said, was what about those people who aren't paying attention to this? Those people For instance, Michigan. You're familiar with Michigan, right? There was a plot there to kidnap a sitting governor, and it was basically pulled together by some people who had just just to be honest about it, just ridiculous excuses for what they thought they were doing when they were in court. So what I'm talking about is there are those people who might have seen the broad picture of what happened on the 6th of January, but not thought about the nuances or the repercussions, and may not even be paying attention to the trial or any of that, but may still harbor that sentiment, that anxiety, that anger, and frankly, that ignorance that
Yeah.
would propel somebody to engage in this kind of thing. What about those people? Are they still out there? I'm sure they are. So what do you do about that?
Yeah, well, you're absolutely right. They are still out there, but I do think that the environment has changed for those people somewhat. I think that there was a time when, I mean, look, we're talking about an attack on the Capitol that came together in a way that at the time seemed somewhat spontaneous. Now we know in the aftermath that it was not spontaneous at all, but for those people who are out there who have been sort of floating beneath the radar for a long time, harboring these anti-government views and working together and really to sort of talk about, really a bunch of rhetoric about what needs to be done. Those people may not have been on the radar of our law enforcement officials in any way comparable to the way they are today. The government is watching those individuals. We're paying close attention to who they are and where they communicate and what they communicate about, and we're trying to understand their intentions. And so you're right, JJ, in that they may not be paying attention, but we're paying attention to them. And I think that that's going to be the key to preventing something like January 6th from happening again.
One of the things they also ran into in reporting this story and looking into it was talking to people from the FBI and other law enforcement agencies and people who formerly worked at some of these agencies, who talked about the fact that there was really no parallel um, being drawn between people who engaged in domestic terrorism, which is essentially what took place on the 6th of January, and those who engaged in the international, the larger groups. But at the end of the day, it was the same thing. It was an attack on the U.S. government, and that there needed to be some change in the view from internally the U.S. and from our legal system in terms of how these people were dealt with. They needed to be dealt with the same way any other terrorist would. And one of the things that I ran into quite often was people who wanted to cut some of these people a break because they were Americans, and there's this free speech thing, and I don't believe that for a minute. But has that problem been solved?
Yeah, it's a great question, JJ. And I'll tell you that early on, I think national security officials really struggled with this. But let's be very clear about this. What happened on September 11th and what happened on January 6th were both terrorist attacks on the United States, full stop. I think that in the aftermath of January 6th, there was a lot of debate about whether or not individuals who were not only U.S. citizens, but many of whom had backgrounds or experience in law enforcement, some who had backgrounds or experience in the military. I think that we struggled to wrap our head around the idea that those individuals could potentially be responsible for a terrorist attack on the United States, but they were. And I've had people say, well, don't you think there's some people in that crowd who just got caught up in the moment, in the heat of the moment? Well, yeah, absolutely, that did. But getting caught up in the heat of the moment, particularly when we're talking about an attack on our democracy, an attack on our capital, does not excuse the behavior. We still have to be accountable for what we've done. And so I think that we've gotten over the sort of shock and the disbelief that Americans could do this. And I think that the national security officials are moving in the right direction here. And being able to identify this kind of behavior as terrorist behavior. And now it's just a question of making sure that those who might engage in this kind of behavior understand that there is a line forming, a clear line. And if you cross that line, you will be labeled a terrorist.
Moving overseas again, to the situation in Ukraine and that war with Russia. I want to ask you a couple of questions about that. The first thing that was in my inbox today was a source in Ukraine telling me that they depend a lot on Elon Musk's Starlink system, and they have noticed a big price increase in the cost of using that system. And as you know, as a former Marine, and also you worked at the press desk and some other offices at the Pentagon, you know how important a system like that can be for warfighters. So I'm wondering, before we get into the nuts and bolts of the day-to-day of this war, how does that impact the fighters on the battlefield in Ukraine if they don't have access to communications and the ability to track targets, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah, I've seen that reporting as well, JJ, and I'll tell you that I can't understate the impact that can have on troops on the field. Look, ever since the day that Russia crossed that border into Ukraine, we've been very clear that whether it's our allies and partners or whether it's direct support from the United States, that everyone needs to be on board with supporting Ukraine in this fight, and that includes private industry as well. This is not a fight, between two countries who don't get along. This is a fight between autocracy and democracy, and that matters here in the United States. And so, as I said, I've seen those reports. I hope that there's something more to that, and that it's not true. The impact that this will have on the troops in Ukraine, it will be significant. And I think that if this is true, then Elon Musk and those who are increasing those prices really need to rethink this and think about what it means.
At the end of the day, there has been a lot of talk about what Elon Musk is doing in relationship to Ukraine. And, he made this statement not long ago about essentially Ukraine sort of capitulating to what Russia wanted and just ending this war, which didn't sit well with Ukraine. And a Ukrainian official made a statement essentially saying where he could go, and things have just gone downhill from there. Is there a way to rescue this? Or, as I've heard, should Ukraine just move on from Starlink and find another connection, another way to do this?
Yeah. Well, on the issue of Ukraine capitulating, I will just state as emphatically as I can that that's nonsense, and it absolutely should not. Ukraine absolutely should not capitulate. As I said before, this is a fight for democracy. Not since the days of Hitler have we seen an attack on a democracy like this, and an attempt to take over another country. And so what I think should happen here is that the international community and others who have the ability to provide Ukraine with similar resources or with alternatives, I think that those individuals, those organizations, they need to step forward. We need to fill those gaps and dispel with, and I really think sort of stamp out the voices of anyone who says that Ukraine should make accommodations or in any way back off in this fight against Russia. It simply cannot happen. It will have implications for every democratic nation on Earth.
Now to the sort of the day-to-day, the actual status of this war. Russia's been pounding Ukraine's electrical grid and its power generating capabilities, and the U.S. is doing everything it can to help them rebuild and, do this real time, because as soon as they repair something, another thing is broken. It's an ongoing thing, and winter is there now. It's December 1st there, in a couple of hours. And the bottom line on this whole thing with this war is that Russia continues to do this, recognizing that, this is probably, as Jens Stoltenberg, head of NATO, said, them using this war as winter as a weapon of war. So, how does Ukraine, from a military point of view, how does Ukraine navigate this to get to a better place?
Yeah. Well, this is a continuing example of Russia's effort to attack the populace and to make life miserable for the population, for the regular people in Ukraine, as a way of weakening the military. And so, when I look at this here, I think the analysis that the winter is being used as a weapon of war is absolutely right. So what does Ukraine do? I think there are a couple of things. One, Ukraine has been amazingly resilient throughout this conflict, and I think that what they have to do is continue to do what they've done from the very start. They have, I used to say, JJ, that the Ukrainians surprised us again, but at this point, it's no longer a surprise. They are fighting valiantly, and they will continue to do that, and they should continue to do that. As I said before, with regard to the Starlink system, this is the time for partners and allies to do exactly what the United States has done. The United States recently pledged more than $50 million in equipment to support Ukraine's electrical system. We need more of that. And we need to help Ukraine get those systems back in place. I think for the military, this is another area where the U.S. Department of Defense, where U.S. military can help. As you pointed out, I'm a retired Marine, and I remember what it was like going through cold weather training. And I know we've got some amazing technology, amazing equipment that can help Ukrainian forces get through the winter and continue to fight. So there's really two fronts here. You've got to take care of the Ukrainian people, because Russia is going to continue to attack the energy grid. But you've also got to supply those troops on the ground with the equipment and the technology that they need to be able to stay warm and to stay healthy and strong and continue to fight. And I'll just say, one other thing I'll say about this, JJ, think about what it means if Ukraine continues to do as well as they are doing, and if they get through this winter and they still have Russia on their heels. I think that will send a clear message that this is, something we all think already. This is over for Russia. We have to remember also that it's winter in Ukraine, but it's also winter in Russia, and that's going to have a significant impact on their ability to keep up the fight at this pace. So I'm expecting, I'll tell you, I'll go out on a limb here and say that I'm expecting in the next 3 to 4 months that we're going to see a significant change in the direction of this conflict.
Well, that said, I need to ask a follow-up question about that. Change in the direction of this war, and I'm thinking you're talking about in a positive direction for Ukraine.
Absolutely.
But Ukraine, as you mentioned, has Russia on the ropes. So what direction does this go in then? Does this mean what you're suggesting is Ukraine will then be on the offensive inside Russia? Or what are you exactly getting?
Well, I don't foresee a time when Ukraine is inside Russia. What I do see is, there's been a lot of talk about what Ukraine needs to do in order to yield to Russia's will here. I think that we are rapidly moving toward a point in time in which that conversation shifts, and we begin to talk about what Russia can do at this point to save face, because it's clear that they have decisively lost the ability to continue this conflict. And so what I see here is, when we look at the amount of munitions that Russia is using right now, you cannot continue this pace through the winter at the pace that they've had up. And we've seen their lulls when we know they've been low on munitions. We've seen them it sort of die off, and then we've seen it come back. They can't continue at that pace. We've also seen instances in which Russian troops have pulled back from areas, and we know that their command and control is not the reason that they're pulling back. They're pulling back because they realize on the ground that they can't continue the fight. So we're seeing these things happen and with more frequency. And at some point, Vladimir Putin, the Russians, they're going to have to begin to think about how they get out of this and still claim some sort of victory or some sort of righteous position as a result of this conflict.
All right, Shawn Turner, former director of the Office of Communications in the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, and I correct myself, you corrected me, but you are a retired Marine, and there is a difference between that and a former Marine, and I understand what that is. And also somebody who's very smart, who's worked at the White House National Security Council. So thank you again for joining us.
Always a pleasure, JJ. Thank you.